On page 338, we're looking at the Husak article, and Husak makes the case in favor of drug decriminalization. He's got a particular meaning for that. He makes it on the basis of standard moral grounds. By that I mean he references consequentialists and also deontological approaches or justifications for his decriminalization stance. Okay, so if you look first of all at the consequentialist justifications that he offers. This is on 338. He says the basic idea is that no law should be enacted unless it works. A law works when it reduces the prevalence of the type of conduct it prohibits without causing unintended effects that are worse than the prescribed conduct itself. A criminal law against the use of drugs does not work if it is ineffective or counterproductive. This is a long-standing argument against laws prohibiting the sale and use of drugs. Okay, and when I talk about drugs in the context of this discussion today, I guess I should clarify what I mean. In the United States, there are different classifications of drugs, which are called schedules. A Schedule 1 drug is a highly addictive drug that can be easily abused and that is substantially damaging to the body or to the mind when it's used. Examples of Schedule 1 drugs are things like LSD, cocaine, I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank on my drugs right now. If you name drugs, I can tell you what schedule they are. Schedule 2 drugs are drugs that are, actually marijuana is still a Schedule 1 drug. We'll see if that remains the case because it's such a politicized drug right now. Schedule 2 drugs are substances that are not quite as addictive, but that are still highly addictive and that have medicinal properties. So an example of a Schedule 2 drug is fentanyl or Vicodin. Or I remember the other Schedule 1 drug I was going to mention, heroin. Heroin is a Schedule 1 drug. Okay, fentanyl or Vicodin. Ketamine, I believe, is a Schedule 2 drug. The kinds of drugs that tend to be closely regulated and dispensed not over the counter but only through pharmaceutical licensure and under the auspices of medical prescription. Those are examples of Schedule 2 drugs. A lot of the painkillers that are subject to the opioid controversy right now are Schedule 2 drugs. And the schedule classification goes all the way down to Schedule 5. Schedule 5 drugs can be abused, but they're not very addictive. I think Robitussin is a Schedule 5 drug, so it's very mild. Can certainly be abused, but not something that's easy to abuse. Okay, and so when Husak is making the argument that drug criminalization does not work, he is drawing on a long-standing claim that dates back a number of decades in the United States, referencing the inability of drug prohibition to prevent people from using hard drugs. When he's talking about drugs, he's referring to Schedule 1 drugs especially, which are the hard drugs. He's not really referring to gatekeeper drugs. Marijuana is considered a gatekeeper drug, although it is a Schedule 1 drug. It's generally seen as an entry-level drug. Okay, Ambien is an entry-level drug. I think Ambien's Schedule 3, I believe, but that's another example of something that Husak is not mentioning or does not mean. Okay, so Husak writes here at the bottom of 338, despite billions of dollars invested and millions of persons arrested and convicted, rates of drug use remain high. Even when the use of a given drug falls dramatically in the span of a generation, as with cocaine and LSD, those numbers have now reversed since this article was published, by the way. Cocaine is at its highest usage ever right now. It is hard to believe that criminal punishments account for these patterns. Okay, so it's a straightforward argument that we're looking at here. The argument is that it doesn't work. It doesn't prevent people from usage, and certainly not in greater numbers than they would otherwise do. I think here, in response to this, that it's kind of hard to produce statistical evidence either for or against this claim, just speaking as an observer of this consequentialist argument. So it's something that a lot of people have offered, but since drugs are prohibited, we don't have statistical evidence available to us about the usage numbers, or about what would happen to the usage numbers if decriminalization for hard drugs were to go into effect. Recently, in the November election, in the first week of November, Oregon decriminalized possession of hard drugs, a number of different kinds of hard drugs. So if that does indeed stick, we'll see if that can provide us with some statistics on usage rates. So I'll just leave it at that and move on. I'm just going to canvass some arguments here at the start, and then I'll throw it open for comments or reflections on the efficacy of the arguments that are being made here. Okay, more consequentialist arguments can be marshaled on page 339 at the top of the page. Again, we're not doing deontological arguments still, just consequentialist ones. He says, an even more worrisome allegation made by utilitarians is that drug laws are counterproductive, causing more harm than good. Drug prohibitions have several pernicious side effects. I will mention only 5. First, the enforcement of drug laws has eroded privacy and civil liberties. Second, the health of users is unnecessarily damaged because buyers do not know the strength or purity of the substances they consume. Third, efforts to slow production where drugs are produced have caused unbelievable violence and corruption. Fourth, arrests and punishments cost billions of dollars of tax resources that could be put to better purposes. And a fifth is that when the state cannot punish all of the people who commit a crime, it can only punish some, and the state discriminates especially against minorities, including especially blacks and Hispanics, in its enforcement of its drug prohibition laws, arresting them at much higher rates than other kinds of users tend to get arrested, although the statistics about usage might not be that much different across the different demographic groups of citizens. Okay, so this is a grab bag of various consequentialist arguments against prohibition of drugs and in favor of decriminalization. Like any applied topic, it's a topic that the drug decriminalization topic is a topic that has all the messiness of real-world interfaces. Okay, it's not just a clean-cut theory-based discussion. So for that reason, a lot of the arguments here require statistics or depend on empirical surveys or sociological analyses, especially the consequentialist arguments. And although Husak is not referencing them here in this article, some of these arguments do have good statistical backing, like the argument about higher arrest rates for blacks and Hispanics when it comes to drug enforcement. It has good statistical backing. Others, like I mentioned, might not have especially good statistical backing because we simply don't have enough instances of them to know, like societies that have legalized hard drugs for long periods of time. We do have a few, I should mention here, we do have a few cases of small countries that have done that for a long period of time, like the Netherlands. But in that case, the statistics, it's very political, and the statistics kind of depend on which side of this debate you're on. Okay, that's the grab bag of consequentialist arguments in favor of decriminalization. In a minute, we can go to the deontological arguments, but let me stop and ask if there are questions or comments so far about these particular arguments and whether you agree or disagree with them. You can highlight some of the ones that I glossed over pretty quickly too if you want to spend a little bit. We can spend some more time on them and camp on them for a minute and talk about them if you want. What do you guys think of these consequentialist arguments so far? For instance, do you think that the violence and corruption that are part and parcel of the drug trade these days would go down if drug sale and possession were decriminalized? Okay. See a couple of us shaking our heads no. If you don't think that it would, defend your position. Why don't you think that it would? I actually am sympathetic. I just want to hear somebody say it.
I don't think it would, because even though there are some laws that do criminalize possession or the usage of drugs, but people still do it regardless.
Mm-hmm.
And there's still instances where, so we were actually talking about this in my intro to criminal justice class, and I was thinking what exactly could we do to prevent the usage of harsh drugs? I mean, I don't think people should use drugs anymore, but there are people who want to make, for example, marijuana and things like that. They want to make it for recreational use,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm against that. I've seen my boyfriend, he's a police officer, and he's told me so many stories. And there was a guy driving on the freeway, and he was going the wrong way, and he hit a girl who was driving, and she died. She tried to make it, but he was on drugs, and he was under the influence of alcohol as well. And so it's things like that make, because people are irresponsible. Most people are irresponsible when they do consume drugs and alcohol. So that's why I don't think that it will help.
So what do you guys think about this claim that Husak makes about how usage, well, I guess it's an implicit claim, but the explicit claim that he makes is that prohibition does not decrease usage. What do you guys think about that claim? Do you think usage would increase if legalization of hard drugs were to occur?
For places that have had it, it would spike at first, but then it
might plateau after a bit. Mm-hmm.
So, I went to California and passed by the stores and everything, and they were pretty empty. So I was and for people in Texas.
Was that for hard drugs or was that for the marijuana stores?
Marijuana stores.
Okay.
And they were empty, so I was it's not a high demand or anything. But if it was to now become legal in Texas, let's say, we haven't had that privilege yet, so there might be a spike when it first happen, and then it'll plateau. So I think it'll when people say you can't do it, they still find ways to do it, and if you can do it, it'll it's not as fun anymore.
Sure. Yeah, the fact of the prohibition often increases the enticement of the wrongdoing. That's just human psychology. Good. Okay. Interesting. So this is not based on statistics, since we don't have a widespread case of legalization to cite, but I actually think, probably based on my own psychology and my experience as a parent, that legalization would lead to increased usage. And that's just because I think prohibition makes the substance less accessible. And the fact of the less accessibility, I think, means that a lot of the people who would otherwise don't use because they're lazy users. I think the majority of human beings are lazy users. In fact, the majority of human beings are just lazy in general when it comes to vice. just like we are when it comes to anything, right? We don't actually proactively make an effort to engage in vice. Instead, we sort of fall into it, like slipping off a log or something like that, because it's available. Okay, so just speaking personally about myself, when my wife brings mint Oreos home from the grocery store, I will have more of them than when I have to go out and get them myself at the grocery store, because I'm a really lazy Oreo user. Now, and I wouldn't say I'm an out-of-control Oreo user, but I'm not necessarily a very self-controlled Oreo user. The fact of the availability increases my usage. When they are on the kitchen counter, I'm much more likely to use at high levels than when my wife has hidden them, which I make her do, because I can't handle it. I make her hide them. She's got various hiding places around the house. And I guess based on that experience, and also my experience as a parent with what's prohibited and what's allowed for the kids, I guess my take would be that usage would increase if prohibition were suspended. I don't know, just a thought. But obviously that's a disputed point. Let's talk a little bit about the harm principle, which is something that has come up in class before in some other contexts, but it's really important when talking about the drugs topic. And I want to just introduce it here. It's not in the text here, but I'm just going to introduce it here as a way of conceiving of some of these consequentialist arguments. The harm principle is a very famous ethical distinction made by John Stuart Mill originally in his text on liberty, written in the mid-19th century. Okay, and the harm principle, according to Mill, is that behaviors should be outlawed or prohibited if they render harm to others. Okay, otherwise, behaviors ought to be free or allowed. That ought to be the default position of governments, according to Mill, because liberty, individual personal freedom, that is, ought to be the default experience of human beings. And if a behavior is not harming anyone, for Mill, it ought to be allowed. But if it is harming somebody, demonstrably harming someone, then it can be justifiably prohibited. So let me just ask you guys, with regard to two demographic groups, self and others, do hard drugs cause harm? I'm not talking about softer drugs here. I'm talking about harder drugs. Let's say cocaine or heroin, for instance. And let's stick just with self, for instance, for now. Let's bracket others. Would governments be prohibited, would they be, would they be justified in prohibiting hard drug use if the only parties harmed by the hard drug use were selves and not others? Okay, so if the only party harmed by your cocaine use in your home was you, maybe you did it, maybe you're single and you did it on a Saturday afternoon, you don't even have to go into work until Monday morning. If the only party harmed is you, is government justified in prohibiting it for the sake of protecting you from yourself and improving your life and flourishing? What do you guys think? That's a very controversial point. That's like the to say the government is justified in prohibiting drug use if the only party being harmed by the drug use itself is a more conservative stance, less progressive. It's more conservative. What do you guys think of that claim? Would governments be justified in prohibiting drug use if self alone was harmed?
Under the principle, the government will not be justified
Okay.
Because the principle states if no others are harmed, then the government shouldn't intrude or prohibit anything that, even if it harms the self. There's no other party being injured in the process.
Okay. Are there laws that protect us from injury against ourselves?
Seatbelt.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's the same principle, isn't it? If you hit somebody else, and let's assume again that you're single and you're not going to leave a bunch of minor children, without a parent. If you hit somebody and you don't have a seatbelt, pretty much it's just you who gets harmed, assuming the other person is wearing a seatbelt and is adequately protected by the seatbelt. Can government justifiably require you to wear a seatbelt, since the only party likely to be harmed in an accident from not wearing a seatbelt is just you? Or is that an infringement of our freedom? We've become habituated into the idea of seatbelt laws, so this might not be a fair question because we've lived with this for so long and we just think that it's so inane not to use your seatbelt when you're driving, since there's such little inconvenience to doing it. Okay, but think about that. We do have laws that prohibit things when the likely only party being harmed is self. What about others? And this is a bit of a more controversial claim or case. First of all, so two questions. First question, is it possible to use hard drugs without doing harm to others? And the second question is, are governments justified in prohibiting hard drug use if harm to others can be demonstrated? So let's do the first question first. Can you use hard drugs without doing harm to others? LSD in your own home, on the weekend, cocaine you can use uppers and downers to regulate your moods as required. Marijuana is a downer for most people. I was reading a quote, I think it was the Houston police chief, or maybe it's the Dallas police chief, I can't remember. Anyway, he said that their standard assumption is that 10% of the drivers on the city's highways at any given time are driving under the influence. 10% of the drivers. Now that means all sorts of substances. That means alcohol and mild drugs and harder drugs. So that means everything. But 10% are driving under the influence at any given time. I was kind of shocked by that. Can you do hard drugs without harming others? My intuition is probably not. Maybe if you're like a really isolated person, retired, in a cabin, whatever, it might be possible to do it. But for most of us who have social connections, the fact of the usage harms others, I would think. Certainly, if I were to use hard drugs, I would be harming others by virtue of my inability to do my job well, my inability to parent well, the various other behaviors that I do to try to cope or compensate. My family would be harmed. But maybe if we could come up with some really isolated people, we could talk about doing drugs without harm to others. But for the great majority of us, I think probably harm to others would be a standard assumption. Is that shared when I say that? Do people mostly agree with that comment? If not, you can push back and we can talk about it. Okay, but it is for that reason, and primarily for that reason at least, that hard drugs are prohibited still, in spite of these kinds of arguments that Husak is making here. It's because of harm to others. You can do all sorts of nefarious things to yourself. Okay, and we do have laws against suicide, and we have laws against other stupid kinds of behaviors. But it is to protect the vulnerable who are not themselves making the foolish choice, but are harmed by the foolish choice. That is the primary reason why we have laws prohibiting hard drugs. Okay, it's just something to think about. The harm principle is very central to this kind of a debate. Okay, I want to zero in, before we go to the deontological arguments in a minute, I want to zero in on one other argument, because this is a really troubling one for me, and that is this irregular enforcement argument. So I'm thinking here about the higher incarceration rates for blacks and Hispanics as a result of drug offenses. The incarceration rates, the statistics suggest, are higher across the board for blacks and Hispanics. And this is independent of usage rates. In other words, if you take a given population, let's say of whites, and a given population of blacks, and they have equal levels of usage of hard drugs, the blacks are getting arrested at higher rates and incarcerated at higher rates. Now, maybe that's incarceration on the basis of socioeconomic discrimination and not racial discrimination. That could be the case. But even if it is the case, still, if it is just socioeconomic discrimination, the African American population suffers at a higher rate than the rest of the country because of the higher rate of African Americans who are in impoverished socioeconomic classes. So it still amounts to the same thing. That's really disturbing to me. Is it disturbing enough to favor legalization or decriminalization, as Husek calls it? Let me throw that out there and see what you guys think. Is that a decisive argument, a dispositive argument? What do we think of that one? At the very least, I hope it is a disturbing argument for you guys, like it is for me. And let me sharpen it a little bit. Let me say this for those of you who say, well, what we need to do in that circumstance is just improve and reform our criminal justice system and some of the dangerous and damaging irregularities in incarceration. We need to improve that. I would respond to you, okay, I agree, but this is the criminal justice system that we have right now. And since it is an applied topic, we're not talking about ideal, equitable incarceration rates. We're talking about real-world circumstances, and in real-world circumstances, racial discrimination is a deep historical fact, and it runs very deep in people's, police officers or the general public even, their perception of things. And that can lead to, in fact, it probably does lead to these higher incarceration rates. So given the world that we have, is this a sufficiently worrisome kind of a reality to justify decriminalization? I'll just leave that, let that very uncomfortable argument just kind of hang there and see what you guys think. Okay, no worries if nobody has a comment on it. I do commend it to your attention and just, think about it. Okay, let's talk about deontological arguments. Okay, Husek writes on 339, a second argument for decriminalization maintains that drug prohibitions violate moral and legal rights. The enforcement of these laws has always raised concerns about privacy. According to some philosophers whom we might call libertarians, drug prohibitions themselves also violate the right to do whatever you want with your own body unless you harm others. Of course, the existence of this right is controversial. Arguably, whether a person has a right to do something to his own body depends on what happens when he does it, but additional rights might be violated by drug prohibitions, etc., etc. This is an argument that says that whether or not the consequences of drug prohibition are successful and constructive for the society. It is wrong prima facie, prior to the consequences, to prohibit drugs and criminalize usage or sales, because doing so infringes upon personal privacy, or it infringes upon a realm of autonomy that people have. Okay, often we'll hear in contemporary ethics these days, this especially comes up in the abortion topic, but also in the euthanasia topic and some similar such topics, that when it comes to fundamental life decisions, people ought to be given a kind of a realm of autonomy where they are allowed to make their own fundamental decisions for themselves. Okay, whether that is ending their life because they no longer see a reason to continue living, or whether that means ending a pregnancy or something like that. The argument goes people ought to be able to make fundamental life decisions. And to prohibit someone from possessing drugs or from selling drugs to another, especially though from ingesting drugs for oneself, so goes this argument, it is to hinder one's ability to make those fundamental life decisions. Are there circumstances in which authorities outside of us may justifiably dictate to us fundamental life decisions? Or ought such decisions to be sacrosanct, so to speak? Ought they to be the kinds of decisions that we ourselves can make for ourselves, always and everywhere, regardless of the good intentions of external authorities? Okay. All right, I'll just lead us a little bit on this discussion. I'm not a rights fundamentalist when it comes to these kinds of topics, although I do think that there ought to be a default assumption that people ought to make fundamental life choices for themselves. Still, if other kinds of moral considerations are in play, and those other kinds of moral considerations are really important, they can sometimes override people's right to make fundamental decisions for themselves. Okay, so for instance, on the abortion topic, although I do definitely think that the default assumption ought to be that people should have control over decisions pertaining to their bodies and their medical futures, at the same time, if a life is at stake, and I do believe the fetus is a person, then that might justifiably override other considerations. Or on the euthanasia topic, a similar kind of reasoning I think could be employed. On this particular topic, it strikes me that no life is at stake. The greatest thing that is at stake outside of this personal autonomy claim that Husak is defending, the greatest thing that is at stake seems to be damage to the society as a whole. And let's be honest, it does damage the collective moral fabric when people are using hard drugs. Even if their own productivity at work is not harmed, still at the same time, the fact that they are using increases the allure or the awareness among others in the society that usage is going on and that it's possible to use. Okay, so for instance, let me just stick with the Oreos example in my own house. When I know that my wife is eating a bunch of mint Oreos, even if I don't directly see her doing it, but I know she's like, I don't know, downstairs eating a bunch of mint Oreos, it makes it more enticing for me to want to eat mint Oreos too, just speaking psychologically. So that's probably the biggest thing that's at stake here, over and against which personal autonomy needs to be compared. Is it sufficient to justify overriding personal autonomy? That's the question. That's the question. And since I do favor prohibition of hard drugs at the end of the day, I would say yes. Yes, I think it is. But certainly there are people of goodwill on, on all sides of this topic, and some people would say that, harm to the collective or to society is insufficient to justify prohibitions that override personal autonomy on matters of fundamental personal importance. Okay, there are people of goodwill who I have long-standing friendships with who hold the opposite view on this. Any comment on that before we turn to the next article? Yes.
It's kind of weird to me. I mean, I see the point of like where it can cause harm to society because you see usage in for something like curiosity or just trying to not be socially pressured, but also in innocence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
At the same time, there are some that can use it responsibly for like certain aspects of themselves, and those that either do it for financial gain, or it's like for people that just abuse it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like good to put a restriction on something that may help someone, but also still cause harm to others.
Sure. Yeah. So that's a great comment. It might be illuminating for us to consider here what most people consider to be a milder drug that's not. It was at one point prohibited in this country, but is now no longer, and in fact is used by 70% of the population. I think maybe 80%. I'm talking about alcohol. 80% of the population, adult population, I think uses alcohol. Does it impair people's ability? Yeah, a lot of the time. Does it lead to collateral damages that are harmful to others? Oh yeah, for sure. Probably domestic abuse cases would collapse in number if we prohibited alcohol and were successful in enforcing it, or traffic accidents, or you name it. I mean, alcohol is the lubricant of all sorts. I mean, rapes, right? They would probably plummet if alcohol were successfully prohibited. So why don't we? Why don't we prohibit it if it leads to all of these other kinds of harmful things? Well, I take it that there are a couple reasons why we don't prohibit it. One reason for sure is the practical reality that 80% of the population uses. So enforcement would not be possible. So that's just a practical reality. But the other is probably that alcohol is not as substantially damaging as hard drugs. And I recognize this is controversial since there are a lot of people who can't handle alcohol and don't use it as a result. But most of the population can responsibly drink. And when they responsibly drink, although it's probably not the best thing for their liver, and there are, health consequences to using, especially in excess, still, it's not the sort of a substance that's so physically damaging as something like cocaine or heroin or LSD. Okay, if you've ever, encountered up close long-time heroin users, they're physical wrecks. Okay, my cousin used heroin for a number of years, and it's really physically damaging, incredibly damaging. I think that second argument is a major reason why we don't prohibit alcohol, but do prohibit right now harder drugs, is because of the degree of the physical damage that is done by virtue of the substance. It is a substance of a kind that does substantial physical damage to humans. Now, that goes back, I appreciate your comment, Jessica, that goes back to the question of whether the wrong that comes about, or the harm that comes about through usage, is sufficiently bad to justify overriding people's realm of personal autonomy when it comes to important, fundamental life decisions. And I guess your opinion on whether it is sufficiently bad to justify overriding people's autonomy, I guess it boils down to how bad you think the drugs are, how damaging you think they are to us physically. If you think they're really damaging to us physically, so damaging that that might justify overriding personal autonomy and saying, no, you cannot use this drug, because there are basically no circumstances in which use of this drug is a constructive thing. If you think that it's really damaging, then you probably favor prohibition. If you think that it's, it is possible to use, like people use alcohol, responsibly in ways that don't lead to substantial physical damage, then you probably will not favor prohibition. You'll probably favor some sort of decriminalization. So the question probably boils down to how bad you think the drugs are for us. Just, that might help illuminate a little bit what we're talking about here. Yeah. Okay, let's, oh shoot, I got 1 minute. Okay. If you look at the Demarnev article, the Demarnev article is a kind of a mirror image of the Husak article. Okay, I'll just point out a couple of interesting points that seem to me to be a little bit different than what we've already talked about. Okay, the ineffectiveness objection is one that Demarnev looks at, namely prohibiting drugs is ineffective in actually preventing higher usage rates. Paternalism, we ought not to be making people's fundamental life decisions for them, or the violation of rights objection is similar. Okay, the high cost of the drug war objection is a reference to the violence that comes about because of the cartels. And then the racial discrimination objection is what I mentioned with the irregular kinds of enforcement. One interesting point made by Demarnev towards the end of the article is the unhealthy foods objection. So let me just read this real quickly. Another argument against drug laws is that if the government is justified in prohibiting us from putting a drug into our bodies for our own good, then it is also justified in prohibiting us from putting unhealthy foods into our bodies for our own good. The suggestion that the government is entitled to control what we eat strikes many of us as outrageous. Why is it not likewise outrageous for the government to prohibit us from using recreational drugs? Okay, I think that's a really interesting kind of an argument. And I guess the structure of it is similar to our discussion a minute ago of alcohol. So the big gulp drinks that we can get at the fast food places, there are basically no circumstances under which those are constructive for us, right? I mean, they're so toxic. They will lead to shortened lifespans, they will lead to diabetes, they will lead to heart problems, they will lead to higher public health costs, etc., right? Maybe immediate psychological gratification after a stressful workday is the only constructive use of those kinds of substances. Okay, but why don't we prohibit them if there are basically no circumstances under which they can be constructive? Probably for the same reason that we don't prohibit alcohol. Same reasons that we don't prohibit alcohol. One is high usage rates, such a high percentage of the population drinks them. And another is they do kill, but they kill slowly. They don't lead to your death within 6 months or 12 months of overdosing and destructive binging or something. Rather, they will lead to your death within 20 years. Because of that, we don't prohibit those milder substances like the big gulp drinks or the massive, you can get triple burgers, I think, at Wendy's now. At least you could the last time my my wife drove us through the drive-thru. I felt like, yeah, I could feel my heart seizing up. I actually asked my wife, can your arteries harden by just thinking about that stuff? Okay, any last questions or comments about this topic? It's a very interesting and controversial topic these days. It will probably become more widespread in the culture as a controversial topic because of I think the marijuana movement is making this a bigger thing these days, and also because there seems to be a smaller movement in the culture towards legalization of hard drugs, although it doesn't have widespread support yet. Any questions or comments?